All right, great. All right, so the last things that we have been discussing last session, if you remember, was the muscle contraction and how a muscle performs a contraction. We started first by sending out a signal that travels from the brain to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle. If you remember, the type of signals that travels down from the brain to the spinal cord and then from the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle is an electrical signal in the form of change in the membrane polarity. What I mean by change in the membrane polarity, what do I mean by an electrical signal? If you remember, this simply means that inside of the cell membrane, during rest, if I'm not conducting a signal, is negatively charged. When I conduct a signal, what I will do is simply flip the charge. So inside will become more positively charged compared to the outside. This is what I mean by conducting an electrical signal along the nerve cells and the muscle cells. If you remember, at the terminal end of the neuron, where I've got the synaptic connection between the nerve cell and the muscle cell, the electrical signal, when it reaches the terminal lobe, this rounded part of the nerve cell, it did allow the opening of a special type of channels called the voltage-gated calcium channels. And if you remember, this will allow the calcium to influx into the terminal end of the neuron. This calcium influx from outside to the inside of the nerve cell will allow the mobilization of the vesicles containing the neurotransmitter, which will fuse with the cell membrane as you see on here, and they will start to release the content of the vesicle to the outside in the gel-filled space between the nerve cell and the muscle cell. Remember, the type of neurotransmitter that we're using in this case is going to be the acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will then bind to its receptors on the sarcolemma, which is the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. The binding between the acetylcholine and its receptor on the muscle side will cause the opening of channels. And one of those channels is going to be the sodium. And remember, the sodium is a positively charged ion. Before getting the signal, the inside of the cell membrane of the muscle cell was negatively charged. When I allow the opening of the sodium channels, the sodium will travel to the inside of the cell and will make the inside to become more positively charged. This is what I will consider as an electrical signal. And this electrical signal is going to be traveling along the plasma membrane. And remember, parts of the plasma membrane are going to be passing to the inside of the cell. We call those parts of the plasma membrane traveling to the inside of the cell my T tubules. Those T tubules are directly connected to flattened tubules inside the plasma membrane. Those flattened tubules are going to be part of the endoplasmic reticulum. We call the smooth endoplasmic reticulum of my muscle cell is my sarcoplasmic reticulum. A sarcoplasmic reticulum normally stores large amounts of calcium. So whenever I get the signal into my T tubules, this signal enhances the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release the stored calcium from inside those tubules to the outside, where I will have high concentration of calcium in the cytoplasm. So now the calcium has been released from the endoplasmic reticulum to the cytoplasm. Remember, the high intracellular calcium levels gonna result in the muscle contraction. If you remember how calcium binds to regulatory protein subunits in my thin filaments, thin contractile filaments. We call those ones are my troponin. Once the calcium binds to the troponin, this will cause a conformational change of the troponin. I have a change in the structure of the troponin, which will cause the movement of the tropomyosin away from the myosin binding sites on the actin subunits of the thin filaments. So once I have high intracellular calcium levels, I will be moving away the tropomyosin, exposing the binding sites on the actin subunits. And once I expose the binding sites on the actin subunits, myosin will form cross bridges to bind to the actin subunit and will start to pull the actin towards the center of the sarcomere. Remember, if I'm putting the two thin filaments towards the M line of the sarcomere, this means the two Z discs attaching the thin filaments are going to be moving closer to one another. So this is going to cause shortening in the contractile unit of the skeletal muscle. This is my sarcomere. So two Z discs are going to be getting closer to one another, shortening the length of the sarcomere. And simply speaking, the muscle cell is formed of many sarcomeres lying adjacent to one another. So if you shorten each one of them, you're going to end up shortening the whole length of the muscle fiber. And if you're shortening the whole length of the muscle fibers in a skeletal muscle, those muscle fibers, as they shorten, I will end up shortening the length, of the whole muscle. Shortening the length of the whole muscle gonna result in the movement that you can perform by this specific muscle. Remember, muscle contraction is simply shortening of the length of the muscle. Any muscle has 2 points of attachment. When you shorten the length of the muscle, you're gonna be pulling one end towards the other. We did also discuss 3 factors that will affect the force of contraction of the skeletal muscle. Remember, skeletal muscle, it's not all or none contraction. It's not either you contract all the muscle fibers or you relax all of them. You're gonna be performing what we call the graded contraction. So we have different strengths of the muscle contraction, which can be determined according to first, the frequency of stimulation. Remember what I mean by frequency, how many stimuli did I get in a period of time. The faster the stimulation, the stronger the contraction, if you remember why. If you are performing faster stimulation, you didn't allow a complete relaxation to take place. So you're gonna still have some calcium outside in the cytoplasm from the previous contraction. When you get another stimulus, this gonna cause more calcium to be available in the cytoplasm. And as a result, you're gonna be performing a stronger muscle contraction as more troponin gonna be moving away, exposing more binding sites on the actin subunits. This is gonna increase the tension of the muscle contraction. If I didn't wait for a complete relaxation to take place, here, the next contraction is gonna be stronger. If you remember, if you've got a very high frequency of stimulation to the muscle, what's gonna happen? You're gonna simply be releasing all the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, getting a maximal contraction for this muscle fiber, and the muscle gonna be kept contracted until you stop receiving this high frequency stimulation. We call this is a tetanic contraction or tetanus. The second factor that we've discussed was the strength of the stimulus. Remember, strength of the stimulus is going to be determining the number of recruited muscle fibers. So if I have a muscle like this, I received a stimulus weaker than the threshold stimulation. This is my threshold stimulus. If I received a stimulus weaker than the threshold stimulation, no muscle fiber is going to be recruited in the muscle. So no contraction going to be detected, no increase in the tension of the muscle. What if you've received a threshold stimulus? If you receive the threshold stimulus, you're going to be recruiting a minimal number of muscle fibers within your muscle. Let's say few muscle fibers on here. And as few muscle fibers contract, you're gonna see a noticeable increase in the tension. This is a minimal stimulus, my threshold stimulus. What if I received a stimulus stronger than thresholds? More muscle fibers gonna be stimulated, and the higher the number of recruited muscle fibers, the stronger the contraction that you will be able to perform. Until when? Until I reach a maximal stimulus. A maximal stimulus is the one at which all the muscle fibers gonna be recruited. So all the muscle fibers in this muscle have been recruited, receiving this strong stimulus. This is my maximal stimulus. This is going to result in creating a muscle contraction at full strength. So this is a maximal contraction that you can perform due to having a maximal stimulus. What if I received a stimulus stronger than the maximal stimulus? Would there be any increase in the tension beyond the maximal contraction? No, because you have already recruited all the muscle fibers within the muscle. So all the muscle fibers have been recruited. So if you increase the strength of stimulus beyond the maximal stimulation, there will be no further increase in the force of contraction once you've reached the maximal contraction. The third factors that affected the force of contraction of your muscles would be the type of muscle fibers that you have been recruiting. Remember, we have three sizes of muscle fibers. We have small muscle fibers, medium, and large size muscle fibers. The larger the size of the muscle fibers that you are recruiting, the stronger the force of contraction you're going to be able to perform during this contraction. So if I have a muscle, let's say in here, it has one large, one medium, and one small muscle fiber. And I've recruited the small one. This is the amount of tension I'm creating. If I recruited the medium ones, this is the amount of tensions that I would be creating. If I recruited the large muscle fiber, this is the amount of tensions that I would be creating. So higher force of contraction due to larger size of the recruited muscle fiber. All right, this is an important factor that we accordingly determine the force of contraction. Remember, we have mentioned that your muscles are in a state of partial contraction all the time. We call this as the muscle tone, and this is what keeps your muscles firm, healthy, and ready to respond. Remember, rather than starting a muscle contraction from scratch, you're going to start at a state where you've got a partial contraction in your muscles. This will make it easier for you to perform the degree of contractions that you want from your muscles. Moving on to the two different types of muscle contraction, we have the isotonic contraction and isometric contraction. What's an isotonic contraction? From its name, iso means constant and tonic tension. What I mean by having a constant tension contraction. This is a type of contraction in which you are able to move the load. So this is my muscle on here, and this is the amount of weight I'm trying to move. This is my load. So I will contract the muscle, and as a result, I was able to move this load like this. So looking inside the muscle at how the muscle tension works, I did have an increase in the tension in the muscle until I reach a degree of tension high enough to move the load. This is a degree of tension that I require to move this load. What happens when I reach this degree of tension? The tension gonna remain constant. I will have the same degree of tension, but what happens at this point, I will have shortening in the length of my muscle. So again, what we're looking at in here, we're looking at an example of contraction in which you were able to move the load. So I would increase the degree of tension until I reach the level of tension that allows me to move the load. Once I reach this level of tension, there will be a shortening in the length of the muscle, allowing the movement of the load. What if you are trying to carry a very heavy weight? So this is my muscle on here. This is a weight I'm trying to pull. So the load here exceeds the ability of my muscle to move. So did you ever try to pull something that is heavier, very heavy, so you can't move it? Are you performing any contraction? If you are pushing the wall, for example, are you performing a muscle contraction? Yes or no? Yes, you're performing a muscle contraction, but were you able to move the wall by yourself? You're not able to move the wall. Why? Because the load that you're trying to move is greater than the maximal tension that you can create in your muscle. So what happens in the muscle? you're gonna start contracting, increasing the tension. So the tension is going up until where? Until I reach the maximal tension that I can possibly create within my muscle. This is the maximal tension I'm creating. And this is the level I cannot exceed here. But the amount of resistance is greater than the maximal tension I can perform. So let's say the maximal tension that I can develop is 6 kilograms. But the weight of the object, the weight of the load I'm trying to move is 8 kilograms, let's say. So the tension is much lower than the weight of the load. Would there be any shortening in the length of the muscle? No shortening. And the weight will not be moving. So here, I didn't have any shortening in the length of the muscle. So we call this type of contraction, it's a type of contraction with constant length. We call it an isometric contraction. Isometric means what? I have constant length. There was no shortening in the length of the muscle. And again, the load here in this case is greater than the tension developed in the muscle. So the muscle neither shortens nor lengthens. So I am not stretching the muscle, I'm not able to shorten the length of the muscle, although I have an increase in the tension. My muscles are contracting, but the level of tension that is created within the muscles is lower than the tension required to move the load. The load is creating a much greater resistance than the tension I can possibly create within my muscles. So I will fail to move the load. There will be no shortening in the length of your muscles in this case. And this is what you see in weightlifting competitions. Because they know already that this is the maximum weight they can pull. So what will they do? They will start with an isometric contraction. So you will see them pulling on the weight without shortening their muscles to reach the maximal tension first. I want to reach the maximal possible tension within my muscles, and then I start to transform the isometric contraction where I'm not shortening the length of the muscle into an isotonic. After I reach my maximal tension within the muscles, transform an isotonic into an isometric into an isotonic contraction. So again, what are the two types of muscle contraction? We have isotonic contraction. Remember, this is when you're going to have a constant tension while shortening the length of the muscle. And this constant tension will allow you to move the load. The load is creating a resistance less than the tensions that you can possibly create in your muscle. Compared to an isometric, the weight of the load or the resistance created by the load is greater than the maximal tension that you can possibly create in your muscle. So where do I get the energy for the muscles to contract? If I'm running a sprint, where do I get the energy needed for the muscle contraction, for example? Stored ATP inside your muscles. This is the first source and easiest source. So ATP binds to the myosin head, it gets hydrolyzed, extending the head of the myosin to bind, bend, detach, bind, bend, detach to the actin subunits. This is the easiest and simplest form of energy, but you have very, very limited amounts of ATP stores in your muscles. So the stored ATP is very little, it only gonna last for few seconds. So when I run a sprint, the first 6 seconds, for example, I'm consuming the stored ATP inside the muscle cells. There is an easy way to create ATP by breaking down creatine phosphate. I have ADP, which is the consumed energy. I did break down the phosphate from the ATP to create my energy. So I have free ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So what will I do? I get creatine phosphate that has creatine attached to a phosphate group, and I will be transferring this phosphate group from the creatine, which is a high bond energy, from the creatine to my ADP to recreate an ATP molecule. So you already have stores of ATP, which will last for 6 seconds, let's say. But you also have creatine phosphate, which is creatine attached to phosphate that is ready to retransform some of the ADP into ATP another time. And this is my creatine that will be released out. So you can rebuild some of the ATPs that you have consumed by using the stores of creatine phosphate. And this is going to be also very limited. So the creatine phosphate going to give you access to ATP for another few seconds. But how can I keep going, contracting my muscle? I need to run a sprint. I need the myosin heads to bind to the actin to detach, bind, bend, detach, bind, bend, detach, bind, bend, detach, allowing the sliding of the filaments. This is how my muscles contract, and all those steps will require the presence of energy, cellular energy, ATP. So if I don't have ATP, I wouldn't be able to perform the muscle contraction. So what will I do? An easy access to ATP, it's breaking down glucose from the blood and from the stores that you have in your muscles. But there is 2 ways for you to break down glucose: a fast way and a slow way. So I'm running a sprint. I don't want to wait for the heart and lungs to pump oxygen to my muscles. I want something fast. I'm running a sprint. So what will I do? I will start to break down the glucose without the presence of oxygen. We call this as an anaerobic glycolysis. Glyco means glucose. Lysis, to lyse, is to break down. Anaerobic means and without. Aerobic means air. So this is a breakdown of the glucose without air, or without, in other words, oxygen. So I'm breaking down the glucose without oxygen. No oxygen is required for this reaction. So what will I get out of this reaction? I will be producing 2 ATP ready to be used by my muscles to keep contracting. And also this will result in the formation of 2 pyruvic acid or pyruvate. The pyruvic acid, it's not chemically stable. You can't keep pyruvic acid like this without having oxygen. So it needs to be transformed into a more stable chemical product that doesn't require oxygen for metabolism. This is going to be my lactic acid. So again, first few seconds, you started by breaking down the stored ATP, which is very limited in your muscles. Next, you try to rebuild some of the ATP, consuming the stores of creatine phosphate inside your muscle. Third, you started to break down glucose without oxygen. You don't want to wait for the heart and lungs to get oxygen to your muscles. You're running a sprint, you need something fast. So you decided to break down the glucose without oxygen, anaerobic glycolysis. What is the problem with anaerobic glycolysis? Actually, you've got two problems. You've got lactic acid that is getting formed, and you have very limited number of ATPs that you get produced from this reaction. So you've got 2 ATP from each glucose. So you've got limited ATP and you've got lactic acid. What is the problem with lactic acid and limited ATP? Those are the two reasons for muscle fatigue. So for how long can you run a sprint? If you run a sprint, for how long can you run a sprint? For how long can you run a sprint? 20 seconds? You personally, when you decide to run a sprint, seconds, around 1 minute, right? Around 1 minute. Few seconds, yeah. So 5-6 seconds for ATP, 5-6 seconds for creatine phosphate. You're gonna be breaking down, and then you're gonna get another 30 seconds breaking down the glucose without oxygen. Why do you stop? Why you can't run a sprint for hours? Like the movies. So you will see in the movies, they will keep running sprints for the whole movie. All right, so remember, you won't have enough energy. This one thing to keep running. You have low energy, but also you are accumulating an acid inside your muscles. You are accumulating lactate or lactic acid. So what you're gonna end up with, you're gonna end up with muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue develops due to lactic acid buildup in your muscles, and the ATP is consumed. You require much more ATP in order to keep going, but you can't supply enough ATP to your muscle cells. So the muscles will be fatigued. They can't keep running a sprint. All right, so again, for how long can I run a sprint? For 30, 40 seconds, 50 seconds. And then what's gonna happen? I need to stop. I can't keep going. I can't keep going. My muscles are fatigued. Then again, what is the reason for the muscle fatigue? Low energy. I can't keep supplying my muscles with ATP. I've broken the stored ATP. I've broken the creatine phosphate. I break down the glucose anaerobically without oxygen. I can't get a lot of ATP from anaerobic glycolysis, and I'm accumulating lactic acid, muscle fatigue. I can't keep going. But for how long can you run a marathon? For how long can you run a marathon? For hours. You can run a marathon for hours, right? It's a low intensity workout. Low intensity workout, not high intensity like a sprint. So how come are you able to keep contracting your muscles for hours without developing a muscle fatigue that will stop you? Because the source of the energy here, when you run a marathon, you've got enough time. It's a low intensity workout. You don't require high levels of ATP all of a sudden. You will be able to supply adequate amounts of ATP as far as you don't need large amounts of them in a short period of time. You're gonna rely on breaking down the glucose in the presence of oxygen. This is an aerobic glycolysis. Aerobic glycolysis means you are using air to break down the glucose. And what's this going to result in? Aerobic glycolysis. You're going to be producing much larger amounts of ATP, much larger amounts of energy, 32 to 36 ATPs going to be produced. You see on here, per glucose molecule. If you break down the glucose in the presence of oxygen, you're producing 32 to 36 ATPs compared to in the glucose breakdown without oxygen. In aerobic glycolysis, you're producing only 2 ATP. So here are at least 16 times the amount of energy that you're going to be producing, yielding from a glucose if you decided to break down the glucose in the presence of oxygen. But remember, in order for you to break down in the presence of oxygen, you need to give your body enough time to supply the muscles with oxygen. You need the heart to pump the blood to the lungs and then back from the lungs after oxygenation, oxygen to be delivered to the heart and so on. So to the oxygen to be delivered to your skeletal muscles and so on. So it needs time. It's a low intensity. I don't require large amounts all of a sudden. Low intensity. So I've got enough ATP. So there will be no major drop in the ATP level. So I won't have muscle fatigue. Another thing that you're going to benefit from breaking down the glucose in the presence of oxygen will be that you're not accumulating something that will cause the irritation of your muscles. So running a marathon, given your muscle cells adequate time to break down the glucose in the presence of oxygen, will allow you to build up carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is going to be breathed out. You're going to be washing out this carbon dioxide from your lungs, and the water is not going to be irritating your muscles. Compared to the lactic acid, remember, lactic acid, once accumulates in my muscles, it starts to irritate the muscle, causing again muscle fatigue. All right. So again, if I'm running a sprint, a short duration exercise, a high intensity exercise, I'm using first ATPs, then I will rely on redeveloping the ATP using stores of creatine phosphate. That's why people who are willing to bulk up, to build up larger muscles, they take creatine supplements. Why would they take creatine supplements? To not feel fatigued while they are performing a high intensity exercise. So I'm holding large weights, but I will be fatigued within a few seconds. So what they do, they supply themselves with creatine for them to get enough energy to keep pushing those weights to enhance the muscle growth. So the muscles won't get fatigued after a brief time during exercise. As you keep going beyond the stores of creatine phosphate, you're gonna be breaking down glucose without oxygen in aerobic glycolysis, which will last for another 30 to 40 seconds. All right, so you can run about 1 minute of high intensity or sprint, for example, or you perform high intensity exercise for around 40 seconds to a minute. All right, so again, started by ATP, then creatine phosphate, anaerobic production of ATP from the glucose. Again, remember, this doesn't require glucose, but the problem, this doesn't require oxygen, but the problem here is that it accumulates lactic acid in my muscles, causing muscle fatigue. If I kept contracting for a longer duration, a low intensity workout, I would be performing an aerobic cellular respiration, which requires oxygen, but it is much slower. Sources of the glucose that you're breaking down. First, I have the glucose stored in the muscles in the form of glycogen, and the ones that the glucose supplied from the blood. The source of oxygen is going to be the myoglobin inside your muscles, and as well the hemoglobin from the red blood cells. So after you run a sprint, you will find yourself breathing faster than usual. Why? Although you're done, you did already run the sprint, why you're breathing faster than usual after exercise? Because you need extra amount of oxygen after a high intensity exercise. This is what we call the oxygen deficit. The way I look at the oxygen deficit is like the use of a credit card. So when you are using a credit card, are you spending your money? Is this the money that you have earned? When you are spending using a credit card, what do you think? Are you spending your own money, the money that you have earned? No. It's you're borrowing this money from the bank or the financial institution. All right, so this is not my money. This is not the money that I've earned yet. So I'm paying money that I didn't earn. The same concept on here when we are performing a high intensity exercise. High intensity exercise. I don't have time to earn ATP money, but I need lots of ATP. So what will I do? I will borrow from the stores in the muscle. I will borrow the stored ATP. I will borrow the creatine phosphate. I will be consuming glucose and break it down in the absence of oxygen in aerobic glycolysis. So I'm borrowing during exercise. I need this extra amount of energy for now. But when I'm done with the exercise, it's time for me to do what to the credit card at the end of the month. At the end of the month, I have to pay back this amount of money. I need to pay back the money that I've borrowed. So the same concept on here. I need to rebuild the stores that I've consumed during this high intensity workout. I need to rebuild the glucose that I've broken down in the absence of oxygen. I need to rebuild the creatine phosphate. I need to rebuild the stored ATP. This is not an amount of energy that I was capable to earn and produce during this short period of exercise. So high intensity workout, I have a very brief period of time. I can't simply produce the energy that is required to perform this exercise. So what I will do, I break down something that it's not produced. I will be consuming something that I didn't earn. I am borrowing from the stores. But after I complete this high intensity workout, I need to rebuild the oxygen reserves. I need to rebuild the glycogen stores. I need to rebuild the ATP and creatine phosphate. So what will I do? I will need to breathe faster. I need extra amounts of oxygen for me to restore what I have consumed during this high intensity workout. I will need to transform the lactic acid to pyruvate again to glucose and to be stored as glycogen. I need to restore all what I have consumed. I need to repay my debt. All right, this is what we call again the oxygen deficit. Oxygen deficit. If you are running on a treadmill tells you this is the amount of calories that you've burned. So let's say you did run, let's say on a treadmill for 30 minutes, tells you you did burn 150 calories, 200 calories, let's say. The amount of energy that has been consumed is this 200 calories. The work that you have performed by the muscle contraction, the actual mechanical movement that you have performed is only worth 40% of the consumed energy. So the mechanical movement that you have performed is only, if you did burn 100 calories, let's say, it's only worth 40 calories, the movement. And 60 calories of what you've burned, 60%, will be transformed into heat that is released from your body. 60% of the energy consumed by your muscles is going to be transformed into heat, and only 40% is going to be in the form of an actual contraction, an actual mechanical movement. That's why when you go to the gym, you are performing a high intensity exercise, you are working out, you're going to be sweating. Why do you sweat? Simply because as your muscles contract, 60% of the energy that they consume is going to be transformed into heat. This definitely will increase your body temperature. And in order for your body to maintain a normal body temperature, although there is a major increase in the amount of heat that you are producing, you're going to be sweating. Remember, factors affecting the force of contraction. First, the number of muscle fibers that I am recruiting. And remember, what is going to be determining the number of muscle fibers that I recruit is the strength of stimulus. Stronger stimulus recruits more muscle fibers. And the more muscle fibers I recruit, the stronger the muscle contraction I create. The size of the muscle fiber. Remember, the larger the muscle fiber that I am recruiting, the stronger the force of contraction. Another factor that we've seen was the frequency of stimulation. Remember, the faster the stimulation, the higher the frequency of stimulus, the stronger the muscle contraction, because you don't allow a complete relaxation after each contraction. So this means you're gonna get a lot of calcium outside in the cytoplasm, allowing you to have a stronger muscle contraction. Another factor on here that will affect the force of contraction, the contractile force, is the length of the muscle. The more I stretch the muscle, the stronger it contracts. The more I stretch the muscle, the stronger it contracts. Why? If this is the myosin on here, and this is the actin, so if the actin if this myosin is in front of the second actin of the thin filament, let's say, I can move just one step. If I imagine that this thin filament has only 2 actin subunits, I can only move it one step. This is the amount of contractions. This is the amount of decrease in the size I can perform. What if I stretched the muscle? So rather than this myosin being in front of the second actin, it's going to be in front of the first actin instead. I still have 2 actins. This is just for simplification. So what is the amount of contraction I can perform? Instead of moving this actin just one step like this, I will move this actin one step, and then this actin to here. This is the first step of contraction. And then I can pull this actin also to move one step further. So instead of moving just one step, I can move 2 steps. So I will have more tension created. So why the stretch of the muscle will increase the force of contraction? Because of how the thin and thick filaments can be aligned. The more stretch I will have to the muscle, the more the myosin gets exposed to actin. And as more exposure takes place, more sliding of the filaments gonna be allowed, and the more sliding of the filaments allowed, stronger contraction can be created, but within limits. So if I overstretch the muscle to the extent where I move this actin even backward, so that I won't have a cross bridge that will be formed from this myosin if this was moved even further. So this cross bridge is not going to be effective. It won't have anything to pull on. So this one, it won't be effective in this contraction if I had to overstretch the muscle. So the more you stretch the muscle, the stronger it contracts, but within limits. If you stretched more than what you need, your force of contraction actually gonna be dropping. All right, don't worry about the details. Don't worry about the details on how this law works. It's called Starling law. So more stretch of the muscle increases the contraction. Think of it like an elastic band. An elastic band, when you stretch the elastic band, I will have stronger recoil. Think of it like an elastic band. The more you stretch, the stronger it recoils. All right. Moving on to two other characteristics of the contraction. It's going to be the velocity and the duration of the contraction. Velocity and the duration of contraction are going to be affected by the type of muscle fibers. I have two major types of muscle fibers. I have the glycolytic muscle fibers. They are fast, but they are fatigable. And I have the slow oxidative muscle fibers. They are fatigue resistant, but they are slow. So which one can you contract faster? Your fingers? Can you move your fingers faster, or your back muscles? Which one? Fingers, right? Fingers can contract much faster, can move much faster. So the muscles that will allow the movement of the fingers are much faster in terms of contraction compared to my back muscles. But for how long can you contract those muscles on here? For how long can you keep moving your fingers? Can you keep them contracting like this all day long, non-stop? Can you do this? No, no. Why? They are gonna contain fast glycolytics, so they can generate ATP by glycolysis, by anaerobic glycolysis, without oxygen. What is the problem here with the anaerobic glycolysis? The problem is that you accumulate lactic acid and you're not supplying the muscle with enough ATP. So the predominant type of muscle fibers in here, in this case, is going to be the fast glycolytic muscle fibers. Fast contractions, but they are fatigable. Compared to the back muscles, for how long do you contract your back muscles? For how long do you contract your back muscles? All day, all day. They are slow, definitely, compared to the ones that are moving the fingers, but they are fatigue resistant. Why? They are slow and in the same time fatigue resistant because they are gonna be containing slow oxidative muscle fibers. Slow oxidative muscle fibers, they are breaking down the glucose in the presence of oxygen. So oxygen, when present, it supplies larger amounts of ATP. And if I supply large amounts of ATP, I'm not producing lactic acid, I am fatigue resistant. So the more muscle fibers that you have of the fast glycolytic muscle fibers in the muscle will become faster but fatigable. And the more that you have of the slow oxidative muscle fibers, the muscle will become fatigue resistant and slower. Another major factor that affects the speed and the duration of the muscle contraction is going to be the weight of the load, which makes perfect sense. If I am moving just a pencil or a pen, moving a pencil here, a pencil. So I can move it up, up, down, up and down, up and down all day long, and much faster compared to if I'm holding a watermelon, let's say, big one. So moving it up and down, moving it up and down, I will be much slower performing the contraction as I have a larger load. So with a larger load, the velocity of the contraction is going down, as you see here on the right side. The velocity of the contraction is going down, and the distance of the shortening is also going to be diminished. Right, with higher load, distance shortened is going to be decreasing with heavy loads, and the velocity of the contraction is going to be reduced. Remember, what is recruitment? Recruitment is the process where you are activating more fibers. Try to imagine you have a company, you are hiring a number of muscle fibers within the muscle. So the recruitment here, if you remember, is going to be determined according to the strength of the stimulus that you are receiving. Also, recruitment going to affect the duration of the contraction and the velocity of the contraction. So think of it in this way. So if I have a cart, let's say, here, and I have one horse to pull this cart. I have a similar cart, and I have 10 horses pulling the cart. This is cart number 1, this is cart number 2. So which one will arrive first? Which one is going to be faster? Cart 1 or cart 2? 2. This is going to be much faster. Why? Because I have more recruited horses to pull on it. And which one can move for longer time? So if I don't have like an end point, I tell them run until you're tired. Which one will keep moving further? Longer duration is going to be also cart 2. So the more recruited muscle fibers, the faster the contraction will be, and the longer the time or the duration of the contraction. All right, so longer duration of the contraction and faster contraction will be created when I have more recruited muscle fibers to allow this contraction. All right, so we can have a 10 minutes break. We come back, discuss the effect